Good evening, friends. Today we have the opportunity of listening again to Mr. Bhawmik, Mr. Sudipta Bhawmik, who is a very eminent theatre personality and also an alumnus of IIT Kharagpur. Today's talk happens to be the final talk in a series of talks on the great Indian tradition of theatre. But nonetheless, each of these talk is self-contained, and I'm sure that this talk in itself is going to be very exciting, though it is also linked to the earlier two talks which have been archived by our academy. Today's talk focuses primarily on the Indian theatre, and we will talk briefly about the talk and the outline of the talk. But before that, let me quickly introduce you to Mr. Bhawmik, especially for those who are listening to this talk for the first time. Mr. Sudipta Bhawmik is an award-winning actor, director, and playwright who has been performing in the Tri-State area stages since 1989. He has acted in and directed several plays in Bengali and English, and has won several awards at different festivals in India, as well as in the US and Canada. He received training in acting and directing at the Pancham Ved Charyasram, a theatre school in Kolkata, founded by Sauli Mitra, and had the privilege of being trained by stalwarts of Bengali theatre like Shambhu Mitra, Tripti Mitra, Sauli Mitra, Mohit Chattopadhyay, and also was trained by the famous playwright and director Badal Sarkar at many of his workshops. Mr. Bhawmik has also acted in a principal character role in Meera Nair's film The Namesake. His awards and accolades are many. Over here, and let me also briefly share with you that Mr. Bhawmik is a published cartoonist, a book illustrator, and a regular blogger. And in that sense, he is a very, very versatile personality. And I'm sure that the insights that he would be sharing with you would be very, very exciting and relevant for people who are keen about knowing about their own tradition. Mr. Bhawmik is a semiconductor design engineer by profession and has a PhD degree, an MTech degree, and a BTech degree from IIT Kharagpur, India. He also has several patents, publications, and awards to his credit. In today's talk, the focus is going to be on the Natya Shastra, with, I'm sure, beautiful illustrations and examples. Mr. Bhawmik would be talking about the very basic of the construction of a theater, the various different kinds of plays like natakas, natikas, prakaranas, prahasanas, farms, and all kinds of the 10 kinds that have been indicated in our texts. The kinds of nayakas and nayikas, the characters that are involved in the plays, the do's and don'ts, the dosas and gunas, the key significance of dance, music, and the guidelines that have been enumerated in the Natya Shastra. He would also be specially focusing in this talk on the Rasadhvani theory, especially the bhavas and the rasas, and the emotions, and the poetic emotions, and the key relevance of poetic emotions in any kind of aesthetic performance. However, I would not like to stand between you and Mr. Bhawmik's talk. So with these few words, I will now request that the talk be presented by Mr. Bhawmik. Thank you very much.
Hello and namaskar to everybody. Once again, I am back with another episode of, or another chapter of the origins or the history of Indian theatre. And today, I'm going to talk about Sanskrit theatre. Nobody exactly knows when or can pinpoint the specific date from where Sanskrit theatre, started or originated, or when the first play was written. It's not very clear, and because, as we discussed earlier, most of Indian history of that period is lost. Okay. So, whatever we could, or the scholars could figure out, based on analysis of the text, based on all kinds of detective work, that maybe it started somewhere around 300 BC, and that period when the Sanskrit play started developing and it continued. But we also discussed that the Natya Shastra went along the development of Sanskrit theater. I mean, I'm sure it didn't happen like the Natya Shastra was written first and then the Sanskrit theater was written. No, I'm sure that was not the case. I mean, the plays were being developed, and many of these came from, I'm sure, from the folk forms and the traditional forms, and they were developed into by renowned playwrights and poets into full form plays that we all can be proud about. Now, although Sanskrit theatres mostly followed the structure and the grammar or the rules prescribed by the Natya Shastra, the 10 kinds of plays and all that stuff we discussed last time, but often, just like any other artists do, their playwrights deviated. They broke the rules. So we cannot always pinpoint exactly what category of play this is, or whether this is really followed, or whether the play really followed the Natya Shastra paradigm, but mostly did to some degree. Now, although we are talking about Sanskrit theater, but one fact we must realize, and that is, not all characters in a Sanskrit play spoke in Sanskrit. Okay? So the kings and the gods or the royalties, Brahmins, those characters spoke in Sanskrit. But the commoners, a soldier maybe, a merchant, or a slave, or a servant maid, they often spoke in Prakrit. Prakrit is like a regional dialect that was being developed that time, and from which most of our regional languages came about. So Prakrit was the language that each region spoke, which are derived some from Sanskrit and some from the local, indigenous words, indigenous concepts. So from the Prakrit, scholars could find clue as to which period this play was from. Okay, that's a very important aspect of Sanskrit theater, because to date a Sanskrit theater or to date a particular play, Prakrit plays a big role. Although we discussed a lot about the structure of Sanskrit plays or Indian theater as prescribed by the Natya Shastra, but Sanskrit theaters have certain very well-defined characteristics. So before a play starts, on the theater or auditorium, wherever, a thing happens, a performance happens, and that's called a Nandi. Okay, people from the Indian origin are pretty familiar with this word, Nandi. Nandi is essentially a prayer, a benediction to the gods and the deities, sometimes Shiva, Lord Shiva, and then also it praises the king, it sometimes praises the playwright, praises the Brahmins. So it's essentially seeking blessings for the performance which is going to be performed after the Nandi. So that's called Nandi. And at the end of the Nandi, when Nandi finishes, Sutradhar enters. And that's what's called Nandiyante Praveshati Sutradhara. At the end of the Nandi, Sutradhar comes in and does what is known as Prastavana. What the Prastavana is, it's essentially, you may say, it's like a foreword, okay, an introduction to the play. So Sutradhar comes to the stage and introduces the playwright, the play, and the characters of the play. So typically this happens when Sutradhar has a conversation with another actor, okay, maybe a nati, an actress, or maybe the vidushak, or comedian or jester. Okay, he talks about the play with us in terms of the conversation, and during the conversation sets up the background of the play. Okay, what has happened before and what's going to happen, a kind of an introduction to the play. So that's what the name justifies, who holds the sutra or who holds the strings of the entire performance. Okay. So and then the nati sings and dances, and the sutradhar then suddenly forgets. Okay, and then they have a very funny conversation. Nati then reminds him, "Hey, didn't you forget? You're going to talk about the play, about something. So what happened?" And in that form, the play is introduced, and after the Prastavana, the actual play starts. Then at the end of the play, or typically during the end of the play, another important thing happens, or another concept which a typical Sanskrit play is called Bharat Bhakya. Bharat Bhakya is something like wishing well, wishing good and prosperity to everybody. Typically, most Sanskrit plays ends happily. And that's why they are called Sukhant plays, plays that ends with happiness. So at the end they say, okay, let everybody live in prosperity, okay, everybody be healthy, wealthy, etc. That's called Bharat Bhakya. Now, it's not that all plays are, ends happily. I mean, there are plays, very few, which doesn't end that happily. One example is like the Urubhangam by Bhas. We'll talk about Bhas later on. And so that's, but that's rare. Most Sanskrit plays end happily. So we have the Nandi, Prastavana, and Bharata Bhakya. They are the three key features of a Sanskrit play. Now there is another thing which is not exactly part of the play or the performance, but it's a precursor to the performance, and that's called Purvaranga. Purvaranga is essentially when it happens before the Nandi, is essentially when the performers get ready to start the play. So for example, the musicians arrive on the play, on the stage, they sit down, they tune their instruments, the vocalists warm up, the dancers might enter and do a warm-up dance. They warm up then the musicians, the actors, as well as the audience. The audience, sits down and prepares themselves that, okay, now the play is going to start. Okay. In fact, many traditional theatre forms like Jatra and others, they also have this phase. I mean, I remember when we were kids, we used to watch the Jatra, and we used to arrive there early, and the moment the musicians come on stage and start tuning their instruments and all, we all get prepped up and wait eagerly for the performance to begin. Okay. So another characteristic of a Sanskrit play are some of the very key characters. Okay. So Sanskrit plays always have some very key characters. One of them I spoke about, Sutradhar, okay, essentially who's like the director of the play or the stage manager who manages the entire performance, and he also manages the team, the company, theater company. He decides who the actors will be, who will be the musicians. He is essentially the man who controls the entire production. Okay. is called the Sutradhar. So that's one very important character in a Sanskrit drama. Another interesting character is called Kanchuki. Kanchuki, the name comes from the costume this character typically wears. It's like a conical robe, typically white. That's what he wears. This particular character usually is a wise old man, okay, but he's dispassionate. He has free access to the women's quarters and to the king and to everybody, and he sometimes performs like a messenger. Okay, sometimes he performs the role of the conscience, or he passes the information from from the heroine to the hero. Okay, from the villain to the king or something like that. Okay, and that's an important character called Kanchuki, typically performed by an older man, a senior man, but sometimes the Vidushak, whom we'll talk about next, performs Kanchuki's role. Okay, that also happens sometimes. The Vidushak is essentially a jester, a comedian who makes people laugh. That's what his job is on the stage. Now, although externally he acts funny, okay, he says funny words, behaves in awkward and weird ways, things like that, but the character often is a very serious person, because at some time within his dialogues and some things, he is going to express some profound sentiments and profound philosophy about the play, about the characters, and things like that. Okay, so Vidushak typically appears in most of the plays which are, falls in the category of Shringar Ras. We discussed about the rasas and babas in our previous episode. So that's when these Vidushak you see mostly prominently, but other plays also have Vidushak character to bring in a touch of humor into the play. Okay. Another important aspect of the Sanskrit theater, and that's prescribed in Natya Shastra and other texts, is called Nepatya. And what is Nepatya? Nepatya is essentially backstage personnel, people who carry the sets and props, people who do all the tasks, build the sets, stay behind to manage the entire production. They are called the Nepatya characters, which is of course essential in any theater, be it during the time of the Sanskrit plays or of the modern times. Another thing Sanskrit plays talk about or are very specific about is what is known as Samvad. Samvad is nothing but dialogues, communicating with the audience and the other characters on the stage. That's what's called Samvad. Naika Samvad, that means what the Naika says. There are several kinds of Samvads or dialogues as prescribed in the Sanskrit text. One is called Sarva Shrabya. Okay, that means everybody listens. So the hero talks to the heroine and everybody can listen. Even the audience, of course, has to listen, but even the characters standing next, or in a, let's say, a scene of a marketplace where a Kanchuki is talking to the heroine in the marketplace, and everybody hears. They possibly look at them if something funny or odd happens, or they go about doing their business. But that dialogue is to be heard by everybody. That's called Sarva Shrabya. Another thing is called Niyata Shravya. Niyata Shravya is some dialogues which not everybody listens to, or not everybody can listen. For example, Janantika. That means the character speaks in Janantik. And what's Janantik? So let's say when two people are talking, when they're speaking their mind, and suddenly one of the characters wants to express something or talk or make a comment about the other character or something else, which the audience can hear, but the other character cannot hear. So what he does, he, for example, says, talking to the other character, he covers and says, do you know, this is what has happened, to the audience. So the audience hears, the other character doesn't. Another kind of Niyata Shravya dialogue or sambadis called apavarita. Apavaritas are like whispers, talking, hiding from the others. Okay, it's not that others cannot listen, because it's spoken such a low voice that the other cannot listen. Ashravya. Ashravya is something that nobody can listen. I mean, of course, the audience can listen, but not the other characters on stage. In English, we call it like a soliloquy or a monologue. Okay, so they're thinking loudly, essentially. When the characters are thinking, I think so-and-so person must be, doing something bad. When he thinks loudly, that's what is called ashravya or soliloquies. But monologues or one person acting, when the one person, performs multiple characters, talks to imaginary characters on stage, which is typically called one-person show these days, is called akasha vashitam, as if talking to the sky. Akasha vashitam, that means the actor or the character is essentially communicating with the audience, but he himself performs multiple characters, he talks about the multiple characters, and so on. In the play, the playwright within parenthesis clearly indicates that this is a Janantika dialogue or sambad, Janantik sambad, or this is a Ashravya sambad. Clear indication to the actor. These are called the character directions as far as the playwright, the way the playwright expresses the way these dialogues are supposed to be spoken on the stage. So now, let's talk about some of the playwrights. Now, Sanskrit theater, as I said, has a very rich heritage, and we have a long list of very well-known, great playwrights and poets. But again, as I said, it is very difficult to pinpoint the dates or the times and the periods or where they existed. For most of them, it's very difficult. But we'll still, the scholars have, done their research on these playwrights, talked about them, just tried to find when did they belong, when did they write those plays, and also, but they have a lot of disagreements, amongst themselves. So we'll take all of this with a little grain of salt. Okay. So we'll talk about playwrights like Ashwagosa, Bhas, Sudraka, Kalidas, Bhuti, Vishakadatta, and Harsha. There are many others, but these are the main playwrights who are till now, even today, some of their plays are being performed, typically in translations, but you will not be surprised to see many original Sanskrit performances too. So let's talk about Ashwagosa. Interestingly, 3 of his plays were found, and they were all found in Russia, in a place called Turfan, and they were later published in India in 1911. But Ashwagosa was not the earliest playwright. Okay, that's for sure, because Ashwagosa acknowledges his predecessors. This is a typical tradition of Sanskrit theater. In the Prastavana section or in the Nandi section somewhere, the playwright often acknowledges the great work done by his predecessors whom sometimes he considers as his mentor or somebody like that, or a guru. Again, scholars tried to dig into his text, tried to figure out which period he belonged to. They think that Ashwagosa was probably a member of Emperor Kanishka's court. He was during that period, sometime around 78 AD to 144 AD. A huge period, but it's very difficult to make it any narrower. Here, 3 plays, I said. The only one play which had a title is called Sariputra Prakarana. Sariputra Prakarana, Sariputra is one of the disciples of Lord Buddha, and it is of the style Prakarana. We discussed about this Prakarana style of plays during our discussion of Natya Shastra. But the other 2 plays, unfortunately, don't have any titles. Okay, and so we are not sure what plays they were. The next playwright, or the significant playwright we are going to talk about, is Bhasa or Bhas. He lived sometime around 300 AD, as per the great Sanskrit Indologist scholar A.B. Keith. And 13 plays are attributed to him. And also it is not clear as to whether the plays that were attributed to him were really written by him. Okay, so except for one work which is called the Swapna Basavadatta, and that play, people think yes, that was written by surely by Bhas, but others, they're not so sure. Swapna Basavadatta is, of course, if you translate to English, it's called The Vision of Basavadatta. That play is, many consider that to be his finest work. The other plays were attributed to him mostly by analyzing the style of the plays, the way they are written, but no specific proof exists that those plays were indeed written by Bhas. Now, Bhas experimented with different dramatic forms from the Natya Shastra. And he drew his material from the Ramayanas, from Mahabharatas, the Puranas. But his works were simple and dramatic. They were not, exquisitely poetic or anything like that. They were meant to be performed on stage for entertainment. 2 of his plays were based on Ramayana, like one was named Pratima, another is Abhishek. 6 plays based on Mahabharata, like Madhyam Vyayoga, Pancharatnam, Duta Vakyam, Duto Ghatatkacham, Karnabharam, and Urubhangam. In fact, Urubhangam is even now performed by a theatre group in Calcutta, although translated in Bengali. And many of these plays are being performed. One play is based on Krishna Katha, it's called Balacharitram. 2 plays based on Udayan stories. One is called Swapna Vasavadattam, which we talked about earlier. Another is Pratigya Yogandharayam. 2 based on folk tales called Abhimakaram. Another one is Charudattam. Now, Charudattam was incomplete, and there's a bit of story to it. We'll talk about it later. So these are the 13 plays which are attributed to Bhas. As I said, Swapna Vasavadattam was surely written by him, but the others people are not very sure. Okay. The next play that I'm going to talk about is another very famous Sanskrit playwright whose plays are even performed today, is Sudraka. Now, Sudraka's famous play, Mritchakatikam, or the Little Clay Cart, which is popularly known in English, from that play, from the Prastavana and the Nandi, we know that Sudrak was a very powerful and charismatic king. who was also very well versed in the arts. And those days, during that bit, many kings themselves also wrote plays and poetry. Okay, they fancied the arts and the performing arts. So Sudra, many believe to be a king, but this claim is not without controversy. First of all, the main controversy comes from the name, Sudraka. A monarch or a king having the name Shudraka. Shudraka means somebody from the lower caste, servant. How can he be a king? So there's the first question. Second is, Shudraka's most famous play, most well-known play, Mritchakatikam, that we talked about earlier, the little clay cart, is an exact copy of the first 4 acts of Bhasa's play Charudattam. It may be that the poet who wrote that called himself Sutraka, or the little servant of Bhasa. He was a fan of Bhas, and hence he called himself the servant of Bhasa, and Shudraka. It's like a pseudonym he used, which was also pretty popular those days. Again, some suggest that Mritchakatikam was not written by one single person, but it was jointly authored by Bhartrimantha and Vikramaditya. Again, no exact dates are available of the period when Sudraka reigned and wrote, but people estimate, that's somewhere between 300 to 400 AD. Okay, again, 100 years, but still that's a kind of an upper limit and lower limit as figured out by scholars. Not without debate though. Sudraka's Mritchakatikam, or the little clay cart, is regarded as one of the finest Sanskrit plays available, even today. If you have seen the film Utsav, is essentially based on the play Mritchakatikam. It has even been performed several times in the West, in America. In the early part of the 20th century, I've seen proof of the little clay cart being performed in New York City, okay, by a mixed cast of Indians and American actors. Okay, so the reason it became so popular in the West is because, first of all, it is a very interesting plot. It kind of depicts the culture and the period of that time. Of that period of Sudrak, and it has humor in it. There is, love is of course one of the key ingredients of the play, and hence it became very popular all over the world. Now this play is about 2 principal characters. One is called Vasantasena and Charudatta. Vasantasena is a pretty courtesan. She was being chased by king's brother-in-law, Samasthanaka. Vasantasena hated Samasthanaka, so she tried to flee from her house where Samasthanaka was trying to come in and grab her. And she sneaked out and took shelter in Charudatta's house. Now Charudatta was a merchant, but due to turn of fortune, he's become a very poor man. He gives shelter to Vasantasena, the pretty courtesan, and they fall in love. The next day, Vasantasena leaves Charudatta's house. She leaves all her jewelry, the jewelry she was wearing earlier, with Charudatta for safekeeping, because she was not sure that when she goes back on the way, somebody may steal the jewelry and kill her. A cunning thief named Sarvalika sneaks into Charudatta's house and steals the jewelry. Now Charudatta was very distressed, so was his wife. because ultimately he had to return those jewelry to Vasantasena. So Charudatta's wife had a pearl necklace. She took the necklace and gave that necklace to her friend Mitra, a Brahmin, and asked him to take this necklace and go and give it to Vasantasena and tell her that her jewelry is gone, lost, just to accept this on in lieu of that jewelry. But before Maitreya could arrive at Vasantasena's place, Sarvalika, the thief, came to Vasantasena and gave her the jewelry. No, not because he knew that those jewelry belonged to Vasantasena, but he wanted to free her girlfriend Madanika, who happened to be a maid of Vasantasena. Now Vasantasena, when she saw the jewelry, she knew that those were her jewelry, which he left at Charudatta's place. But she didn't say anything. She took the jewelry, and when Maitreya came with the pearl, she told her the story, but Vasantasena was very moved by the gesture. In the meantime, another side story, subplot happens. There was a rebel named Aryaka in the kingdom. He escapes the prison and flees the palace, and Charudatta gives him shelter, and they build a friendship. Now, as luck would have it, one day Vasantasena was planning to visit Charudatta, but mistakenly she got on a chariot which was going to Samasthanaka, the wicked king's brother-in-law. Samasthanaka gets hold of her, tries to force her. Vasantasena protests. Samasthanaka strangles her and leaves her almost dead in a pile of dry leaves. Fortunately for Vasantasena, a Buddhist monk was going past. He finds that body. But before the Buddhist monk, also before he became a monk, he knew Vasantasena. So he takes Vasantasena, revives her, and takes her to a Buddhist cloister. Now, since Vasantasena is missing, a very well-known courtesan of Ujjain, Samasthanaka puts all the blame on Charudatta. Says Charudatta, Vasantasena was going to Charudatta, so Charudatta must have killed her. So the king arrests Charudatta and he is tried and he is given the death penalty. He was about to be executed. But when Charudatta was about to be executed, Vasantasena arrives. And obviously, since Vasantasena is alive, Charudatta was saved. In the meantime, the thief, Sarvalika, killed the wicked king. Aryaka, that rebel, was made the king of the land. So Aryaka, being a friend of Charudatta, makes Charudatta a governor of a city next to the capital, and then also frees her from the obligation of serving as a courtesan, and thus enables Charudatta and Vasantasena to live happily ever after. So this was the play Mritshakatikam, a pretty complex plot, and it deals about some of the cultural aspects of the time and certain things that are pretty radical in nature. The main sentiments of this play, or the rasa as we call it, are love, which is Shringar, and pathos, or the Karunras. So Shringar and Karunras are the two key rasas expressed in this play. This play has been considered by many scholars as a prahasana. Prahasana means which is a farce, because of there's a lot of comedy between the Sarvalika and Mitra, but some also classify it as a prakarana. The central theme, as we can all say, is the love between Charudatta and Vasanta Sena. But the key element that distinguishes Mritshakatikam from all the previous plays is the use of conflict. Here we see a hero and a heroine, and then the villain trying to snatch away the heroine from the hero, and then Aryaka, a rebel, trying to overthrow the king. And Samasthanaka also, through his dialogues and antics, makes the villain character also very funny, and people rather laugh at him than being afraid of him. Okay, the use of courtesan as a heroine. Typically, heroines are royal and princesses or the queens and characters like that. But using a courtesan as a heroine was something very, very radical during that time. The use of a clay cart in a very symbolic way is a masterstroke by Sudraka. Okay, the clay cart being the jewel, it can be used as a metaphor for the way the poor and the oppressed getting rewarded and by the society is something that is very difficult to find, especially in theater of those days. Okay, so that's why, as I was saying, that Mritshakatikam is one of the most interesting and intriguing plays of that period. Now let's talk about Kalidas. We all have heard about Kalidas. Kalidas is the most popular Sanskrit poet and playwright. When I say people, I mean the scholars say that he was somewhere during the period of Chandragupta II, Chandragupta II, in mid-5th century CE, between 400 and 500 CE, in the city of Ujjain. Now, there are legends which say that he was an idiot during his youth, like this famous story that he was cutting the branch on which he was sitting and all that thing, and then goddess Saraswati, gives him a boon and he becomes the great poet, and so on and so forth. But those are mostly myths. Also, the legend says that he was killed in Sri Lanka, but again, no proof exists. Keith, W.B. Keith, first translated Kalidas, especially his work Shakuntala, Abhigyana Shakuntala, into English, and he took it to the West in England. And since then, Kalidas is considered as the Shakespeare of India. As people asked him, who's this great playwright? And he said it's the Shakespeare of India. I'm sorry, it was William Jones of the Asiatic Society who first translated Kalidas's Abhigyana Shakuntala, not Keith. Even he was so popular worldwide that the Soviet Russia, USSR, had even released a postage stamp on his name, and his play Abhigyana Shakuntalam is regarded as one of the best plays of the world by many scholars. Okay, along with Oedipus Rex and Shakespeare's plays and things like that. So we all should be very proud about Kalidas and his works. So let's talk a little bit more about him. His plays are, most of them we know, like Ritu Sanghar, Meghadutam, Meghadutam, in which this Jaksha is being exiled, living in exile far away from his lover, and there's a monsoon clouds floating by, and he tells the monsoon cloud to carry his message of love to his lover. Malavika Agnimitram is a play between Malavika and Agnimitra, King Agnimitra. Vikram Urvashyam, then Abhigyana Shakuntalam, okay, of the recognition of Shakuntala. Kumar Sambhavam and Raghuvansam. Kumar Sambhavam and Raghuvansam are mostly Mahakavyas, or epic poetries. Cannot be really classified possibly as a play, but still those are his most significant works. Now, of these plays, the most popular play is Abhigyana Shakuntalam. So here is the story of Abhigyana Shakuntalam. As I said, it means the recognition of Shakuntala. The story goes like this. Shakuntala was the abandoned daughter of Menaka and Vishwamitra. Okay, so they abandoned their young child, and Rishi Kanva adopted her as a daughter. And then Shakuntala grew up in Rishi Kanva's ashram, or the hermitage, along with her friends, her dearest friends like Anusua and Priyambada, as well as the other people in the hermitage, the animals of the forest, and so on and so forth. So it so happens, as Shakuntala comes of age, one day King Dushwanta visits the forest on a hunting trip. Now during the hunting, he kind of wanders away from his main team, and then he arrives near the ashram of Rishi Kanva. And there he sees Shakuntala and falls in love with her. Shakuntala also likes Dushwanta, so they have a love affair, and Dushwanta hangs around for a few days with Shakuntala. But then duty calls, there is some emergency in the capital, and Dushwanta had to go back. Dushwanta then promises Shakuntala that she will be taken to the palace. Either he will come, or maybe some dignitaries will come and take her to the palace as his queen. So he leaves. Now Shakuntala spends her days and nights only thinking about Dushwanta, her beloved. One day, while she was sitting near the door of her small hut, Rishi Durvasha arrived. Now Rishi Durvasha is very well known for his bad temper. I mean, a little thing happens, he gets upset and he curses people like anything. So Rishi Durvasha comes and to the door of Shakuntala, and Shakuntala just pays no attention. She is deeply in thought, daydreaming about Dushwanta and her love. So Durvasha tries to give some indication that he is there, but Shakuntala can't hear anything. Completely ignores Durvasha. Durvasha is very upset. He curses Shakuntala. Whoever you are thinking about, he will forget you forever. He will not remember you as much as you are remembering him. Shakuntala again did not pay any attention. But Shakuntala's friends, Anusua and Priyambada, heard about it, and they came running and they pleaded to Rishi Durvasa, please, please, she is just a little girl. I mean, she is deeply in love. She didn't mean to disrespect you, blah, 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 everything. So finally, Rishi Durvasa feels a little bad and says, okay, this is all I can do. Her lover will remember her only if he, or rather she, shows something that belongs to her lover. Now it so happens, before Dushyanta left, he gave a ring with a royal sign on it, or royal seal on it, to Shakuntala as like an indication of marriage or whatever. So Shakuntala had that ring, and Anusua Priyambada knew that Shakuntala has that ring, so they thought, well, this means this loss of memory is not going to affect at all, because the moment the king sees the ring, he will remember. But Durvasa's curse really came true, and Dushyanta completely forgot about Shakuntala. And he did not come to the forest, did not come to the hermitage to take her back to the palace, neither did he send anybody to take her. But Shakuntala was pregnant with Dushyanta's child, and as the pregnancy advanced, she needed to be with her husband. So Rishi Kanva decided to send Shakuntala to the palace. So there is a very beautiful description, a painful description of Shakuntala's farewell from the hermitage. And Shakuntala travels to the palace. On the way, she goes on a boat, crosses a river, and while she was playing with the water, playing in the water next to the boat, the ring slipped off her finger and sank. And a fish swallowed it. So it was gone. Shakuntala was oblivious. She didn't even notice that the ring was missing. So she goes to the palace, and as fate would have it, Dushyanta couldn't remember. Shakuntala said, "Don't you remember? You married me." He said, "No, I don't remember. I didn't marry you. Who are you?" Then Shakuntala said, "Oh, look, here is the ring that you gave me." But there was no ring. Shakuntala was dejected. She left and took shelter in another hermitage. It so happened that a fisherman caught that specific fish which swallowed that ring. And when the fisherman opened the fish, he found the ring and he saw the seal and he knew that this was King Dushyanta's ring. So he takes the ring and goes to the palace to return it to the king, expecting that he will be well rewarded. And the moment the king sees that ring, he remembers Shakuntala. And then he is very repentant. So he tries to search for her all around, couldn't find her. Later, after many days and after many incidents, Dushyanta gets to meet Shakuntala. Shakuntala had given birth to a baby boy. His name was Bharat, after whom Bharatvarsha, or India as we know it today, was named. So that's the story of Shakuntala, the recognition of Shakuntala, Vijnana Shakuntala. Kalidas's other works, as I said before, Kalidas was really a prolific writer, and he wrote many other plays and Mahakavyas or epic poems. The two other which that are worth mentioning. One is Malavika Agnimitram. Now, Malavika Agnimitram means basically the love affair between Malavika and King Agnimitra. So the story goes something like this, that King Agnimitra falls in love with a painting of a girl. Okay? Apparently the girl was an exiled servant girl. So he madly falls in love with that painting and looks for Malavika and, tries to, with the wish to marry her. But Agnimitra's wife, the queen, doesn't like it, especially having an affair with a servant girl, with a maidservant. So she gets hold of Malavika and imprisons her in the cell. But as fate would have it, it turns out that Malavika was in fact a princess of royal heritage. And then the affair between King Agnimitra and Princess Malavika gets legitimized. She is released from prison and they live happily ever after. Another play of Kalidas is Vikram Urvashyam. Vikram Urvashyam is the story of King Purudavas and the celestial nymph Urvasi. We all know of Urvasi, right? Now, she lived in heavens, but some unfortunate accident happened and she was sent back to the earth as a mortal being to suffer the life of a mortal human being. But then there was one clause which was given that the moment her lover, sees the child, she will die and hence she will come back to the heavens. Well, she goes to the earth and falls in love with King Purudava. And they have a child. But obviously, if Purudava sees the child, she would die. But then a series of events happen, series of mishaps happen, including one time Urvasi turns into a vine, a creeper. But then finally the curse is lifted and the lovers are united and they're allowed to remain together on the earth. So those are the famous plays of Kalidas. Of course, Kalidas, as I said, has many other works which one should read and study. So if you get a chance, at least read the story of Shakuntala. And by the way, the story of Shakuntala is not so new. Shakuntala's story appears in the Mahabharatas. So essentially, Kalidas borrowed that story from Mahabharata and wrote the play. The next playwright that I'm going to talk about is Bhuti. Bhuti was born in Padmapura in Vidarbha, which was in the current Gondia district near Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh border, in the 8th century AD, somewhere around that time. Now, he was believed to be the court poet of King Yashovarman of Kanauj. His works include Mahavir Charita, which is essentially the early life of Rama, Malati Madhava, a play depicting the romance of Malati and Madhav, and Uttar Ramacharita. Uttar Ramacharita is special in the sense that this talks about the period after Sri Ramchandra returns from Lanka after defeating Ravana, and his coronation and then his abandonment of Sita, and then they get reunited later together. So Baba Bhuti's plays are also regarded as some of the classic Sanskrit plays. Vishakadatta is another very important playwright, if not for others, for his one single play called Mudra Rakshas. Now, he was apparently present during the time of Chandragupta II or the Gupta period, 375 AD, but some claim that he belonged during the 9th or 10th century AD also. I mean, there is a controversy regarding Vishakadatta's time. He possibly lived in Patliputra, which is now known as Patna in northern India. His language was very simple Sanskrit. His plays include Mudra Rakshas and Devi Chandragupta. Now, Mudra Rakshas, which is a very popular play, even theatre groups during current times, they perform Mudra Rakshas. This play, it is the story of King Chandragupta Maurya's accession to the throne of Magad with the help of his guru Chanakya or Kautilya. Okay. Chanakya, as you all know, was regarded one of the most intelligent and clever and cunning ministers of Chandragupta Maurya. And he essentially defeats the Nanda king, the Nanda dynasty. And the Mudra Rakshas essentially means that a coin imprinted ring was used to cunningly get a minister of Nanda, whose name was Rakshas, to join the Chandragupta. Okay, so this is considered as a historical and political play of that time, okay, which is pretty rare, a very political and strategic play. Harsha, also known as King Harshavardhan, is also regarded one of the key playwrights of the Sanskrit or the classical theatre era of India. He was a king, a very well-known king, and who conquered a large part of India. And he also wrote plays and poetry. 3 plays of him are pretty well known and pretty famous. One is the Priyadarshika, another is Ratnavali, and Nagananda. Now, Priyadarshika and Ratnavali was essentially borrowed from the earlier works of Bhasa and Kalidas. But Nagananda is the most important play. And in this play, this drama, Harsha combines the Buddhist and the Hindu themes very uniquely. And through that play, one can really appreciate his artistic and political genius. So, with that, I'd like to conclude this session of the Theatre of India. Today we discussed about the structure and the typical characteristics of Sanskrit drama, of Sanskrit theatre, and we also discussed the major Sanskrit playwrights like Ashwagosa, Kalidas, Bhas, Shudrak, Harsha, Bhababhuti, Vishakadatta, and others. I'd encourage you to look into these plays. They're all available in translations. Read them whenever you can. Thank you and namaskar.